My name is Maria. I'm 29, and my birthday dinner was in full swing at my family's vineyard estate when my mother decided to make her final move. "Here's your gift," she announced, loud enough for the entire private dining room to hear, dropping a set of keys into my twin brother's palm. "A brand new Porsche. You've earned it." The room broke into applause. Relatives who hadn't looked at me once all evening suddenly turned my way, waiting for whatever came next. My mother, Georgia Whitmore, reached into her blazer with a theatrical little smirk and pulled out 2 crumpled $1 bills. She set them on the table in front of my plate. "And this," she said, "is what you deserve. Don't spend it all in one place." The laughter started at her end of the table and rolled outward. My Aunt Frances slapped her knee. A cousin nearly choked on her wine. My father, Victor, pressed his napkin to his mouth, shoulders shaking. My brother Brandon just stood there twirling his new keys, grinning like he'd won something. I didn't cry. I didn't get up. My phone buzzed in my jacket pocket, timed so perfectly it almost felt scripted. I pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and looked back at my mother. "Perfect timing," I said, my voice flat. Her smile disappeared. My father's face went white before he'd even seen what was on the screen. "Don't," he whispered. "Please don't do this." It was already done. In a few minutes, every person in that room was going to learn that the daughter my mother had spent a decade humiliating now legally owned the roof over her head. 2 crumpled dollar bills on white linen. That was exactly how Georgia Whitmore had run this family for over 20 years. Money was never just money to her. It was leverage, approval, a leash. If you flattered her, she opened her wallet. If you showed the slightest independence, she made you a cautionary tale at every dinner table she could find. I remembered Thanksgivings where she'd interrupt a conversation just to ask whether I was still buying clothes secondhand. At my college graduation, a degree I paid for entirely myself, waiting tables through 4 years of night classes, she stood up during the toast and offered to hire me as her receptionist so I wouldn't starve. She needed an audience. She needed people to laugh at me so her own success would feel bigger by comparison. Brandon understood the game and played it beautifully. He gave her exactly what she wanted, the illusion of a brilliant, driven son she could brag about at the country club. A wine label that never got past 300 cases. A boutique fashion line that closed after 8 months. None of it mattered to Georgia, because as long as Brandon kept needing her, she kept being needed. She bought him that Porsche not because he'd earned it, but because dependence was the only currency that made her feel like a mother. I chose differently. I left the house at 18 with a duffel bag and $400 from a summer job. I put myself through business school waiting tables in Sacramento, sleeping in a studio apartment with a mattress on the floor, refusing every offer that came with strings attached. That refusal infuriated her more than any failure ever could. When she couldn't buy my compliance, she tried to buy my humiliation instead. What Georgia and every laughing relative in that room didn't know was what I'd built during those years of silence. They still pictured me as the girl who couldn't make rent. They had no idea I was a managing director at a distressed debt fund in Chicago, spending my days restructuring the finances of people who'd lived exactly the way my mother did, far beyond what they could actually afford. She thought 2 crumpled dollar bills were the ultimate power move. She had no idea what existed outside the bubble she'd built for herself. The confidence Georgia wore like a second skin was a facade, and I'd found the cracks in it through nothing more exotic than public records. Once I realized her obsession with appearances had started outrunning her actual finances, I hired a small team of forensic researchers to track her holdings, not private banking data, just tax liens, filings, and public loan records anyone could pull if they knew where to look. What they found was a slow-motion collapse. Georgia had burned through her liquid capital years earlier. To keep the estate running, the country club dues current, and Brandon's ventures funded, she'd taken out a home equity line of credit against the vineyard property, $530,000, drawn down in pieces over 3 years, not for any single investment but simply to keep the lights on. The car Brandon was about to unwrap was the last straw the bank's patience could absorb. The loan hit default status that spring. When a borrower stops paying, the bank marks the note as non-performing and, more often than not, sells it off to a debt buyer rather than run the foreclosure process itself. That's the point where I stepped in. I didn't need any inside information, I just needed to be ready when the note went up for sale. Through an LLC I'd set up years earlier for exactly this kind of acquisition, Crestline Capital placed a bid on the debt and won it, well below face value, because I understood the paper better than the casual buyers who usually chase these auctions. Once the sale closed, the bank executed an assignment of mortgage, transferring the rights of the lender to Crestline. In the eyes of the law, I wasn't just the daughter she liked to mock anymore. I was the secured creditor holding the note on her own house. My lawyers filed everything with the county clerk, making the lien transfer a matter of public record. I spent the weeks before my birthday reviewing the loan's covenants and the exact date her grace period expired. This wasn't petty revenge. I told myself over and over that I was simply acting as a fiduciary enforcing a contract she'd proven she couldn't honor. She still believed she held all the keys. In reality, I held the one document that could end her family's stay in that house entirely. That should have been the end of it, a clean, surgical financial correction. But everything shifted the week I met Marisol in a quiet coffee shop outside Sacramento. Marisol had been the closest friend our older sister Elena ever had. For 7 years, the official family story had been that Elena's death was a sudden, unexplainable tragedy, depression nobody saw coming. Georgia and Victor wore that story like a shield, letting it earn them sympathy at every gathering, absolving themselves of ever having to answer a harder question. Marisol set a small metal lockbox on the table between us. She'd been holding on to it for years, waiting for someone in the family who wasn't blind to George's version of events. Inside were printed emails and a handful of handwritten letters. I started reading, and the floor seemed to tilt under the table. Elena had been accepted into a graduate engineering program on a partial scholarship, but she needed roughly $6,000 to cover her first semester's housing and fees. She'd saved almost all of it herself from 2 years of part-time work, and asked Georgia to cover the gap. Instead, Georgia had taken the money Elena had already saved, sitting in a joint account Georgia controlled, and funneled it straight into Brandon's very first failed venture, a jewelry line that lasted 4 months. When Elena protested, the emails showed Georgia's response in her own words, that Elena was a drain on the family, that she'd never amount to anything, that if she couldn't fund her own future she didn't deserve one. The financial rot that eventually forced Georgia to draw down $500,000 against the vineyard hadn't started with Brandon's failed wine label. It started years earlier, with the decision to steal her own daughter's tuition money to protect her golden child's ego. I sat there with Elena's last messages to Marisol in my hands, increasingly short, increasingly hollow, and understood that what I'd been planning as a financial correction wasn't nearly enough anymore. The woman who'd thrown $2 bills at me across a dinner table was the same woman who had quietly erased her own daughter's future to keep the illusion of Brandon's genius alive. The clinking of silverware pulled me back into the vineyard's private dining room, where my mother was still glaring at me over the wreckage of her joke. Nobody at the table moved. Forks hovered over half-finished plates. I didn't announce what was on my phone. I just looked at her, then unlocked the screen and set it face down on the table. My attorney had sent one word, recorded. The county clerk had stamped everything. The transfer was permanent. I stood up slowly, picked up the crumpled dollar bills she'd thrown at me, smoothed them flat against the tablecloth, folded them once, and slid them into my jacket pocket. Georgia watched my hands, her jaw tightening as whatever moment of triumph she'd been expecting quietly evaporated. She expected tears. She expected me to storm out. Instead, I reached for the small microphone still clipped to the podium stand from the earlier toasts. $2, I said, my voice carrying across the room. It's interesting how much weight we put on money. We use it to measure success, to buy loyalty, and sometimes, to build an illusion. I took a few steps, keeping my eyes on her. You talk a lot about financial strength, Georgia. So I have an honest question about your actual cash position. Why would a self-described titan of the wine business have a severely delinquent mortgage on file with the county? Murmurs broke out across the tables. Brandon's fingers stopped moving on his keychain. What is she talking about? Georgia snapped, stepping toward me, her face reddening. Put that down. You're embarrassing yourself, am I? I asked, not moving. Because real financial strength usually doesn't come with a public notice of default. It usually doesn't need $500,000 drawn against the family estate just to cover country club dues and your other child's failed businesses. The murmurs turned into open gasps. George's composure cracked into something more volatile. She pointed a shaking finger at me. That's enough, she shouted, all pretense gone. I will not have you stand here and spread lies at my event. Someone get her out of here. She scanned the room for staff who weren't there. My father, standing beside her, didn't yell. He just stared at my face, reading the certainty in it, and I watched the color drain out of his completely. He grabbed her sleeve. "Georgia, stop," he whispered. "Please don't do this." That's when I pulled the folder from my bag and dropped it, thick and stamped in red ink, in the center of the table. It knocked over a wine glass. Nobody reached to blot the stain. Every eye in the room went to the papers. I didn't repeat the loan amount or explain the mechanics. I fanned the pages out so the headers were visible from where they sat. The top sheet was the assignment of mortgage, carrying the county's raised seal. Beneath it, the recorded lien transfer naming the new secured creditor. At the bottom, the notice of default, laying out exactly what came next. Georgia lowered her hand. Her eyes landed on the LLC name on the transfer deed, a name she didn't recognize. I tapped the printed line with one finger. "I run that company," I said, my tone level. "I personally bought your defaulted note when your bank decided you weren't worth the risk anymore. That Porsche in the driveway isn't a symbol of anything except the debt that's about to bury this family. And this house, the one you've hosted every one of these dinners in, is now under my legal control." The words landed like a physical weight. The whispering stopped completely. This wasn't an accusation. It was a documented, enforceable fact, and everyone in the room could see it. Brandon stood frozen by the podium. The keys slipped out of his hand and hit the hardwood floor with a sharp, small clatter. He didn't bend to pick them up. His whole identity, the visionary, the golden child, had been built on money that was never really there. My father's knees gave slightly. He sank into his chair, buried his face in his hands, and started sobbing, his shoulders shaking with the kind of grief that comes from watching something you spent decades protecting fall apart in under a minute. Georgia tried to salvage it. She raised both hands, stammering something about a temporary cash flow issue, a bank error, a misunderstanding that could be fixed by Monday. I didn't give her the room to finish. I reached into my bag again and pulled out a second, smaller stack of paper, no county seals this time, just old timestamps, 7 years old. I held them up, and the rustling cut straight through her excuses. "This isn't about a defaulted loan," I said, turning to face the rest of the room instead of her. "That paperwork is just the mechanism. The real debt can't be paid with money." I looked back at my mother, whose face had gone the color of the tablecloth. "These are emails and letters written by my sister Elena. For 7 years, this family has told everyone that her death was sudden depression, out of nowhere. Something nobody saw coming." I read from the pages, my voice steady even as the room went completely still. Elena had earned a partial scholarship. She'd saved for 2 years to cover the rest. When she asked Georgia to release the money already sitting in her own account, Georgia had instead funneled it into Brandon's first failed jewelry line, and told her own daughter, in writing, that she was a drain the family didn't need to fund. "You emptied your daughter's savings to protect your favorite child's ego," I said. "And when she had nothing left and nowhere to go, you told her she'd never amount to anything. You didn't lose her to depression that came out of nowhere. You built the conditions for it, one email at a time." I set the pages down beside the foreclosure notice. "You took her future. So I took yours. Losing this house is the cost of what you did to her." The reaction rippled through the room instantly. An aunt near the front covered her mouth. Aunt Frances, who'd laughed loudest at the $2 joke 20 minutes earlier, took a full step back from the table, putting distance between herself and the woman she was suddenly looking at differently. No one defended her. There was nothing to argue with, it was all in her own handwriting. The exodus started quietly. Coats came off the backs of chairs. Purses were gathered. People filed toward the doors without a word, without saying goodbye, leaving Georgia standing alone at the head of a table she could no longer afford. My father pushed his chair back and stumbled toward me, eyes red and swollen. He grabbed my forearm with both hands. "Please," he said, voice cracking. "I'm so sorry. We can fix this. Please, have mercy." I looked down at his hands on my sleeve, then back up at him. I unpeeled his fingers gently and stepped back. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything left to say that the papers on the table hadn't already said for me. The months that followed moved with the same unglamorous precision as any foreclosure. The grace period expired without a payment. The redemption window closed. Every extension George's lawyers tried to file was denied, because there was no capital behind any of it. Her old contacts in the wine industry wanted nothing to do with a woman whose finances were now a matter of public court record. On the morning the writ of possession was finally executed, I didn't fly back to watch it happen. My attorney sent a short, clinical summary instead. A county sheriff's cruiser pulled up the long gravel drive of the estate, parked where the Porsche used to sit. Deputies knocked, presented the eviction order, and gave Georgia and Victor a set window to gather their things. Brandon had already left the state months earlier, the moment the money stopped moving. Georgia and my father carried what they could into a rented moving truck in cardboard boxes. No relatives came to help. No caterers, no golden child to shield them from the sight of it. The locks were changed that same afternoon, and the property was listed for a liquidation sale within the month. That evening, sitting in my office in Chicago, my phone lit up with my father's name. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again almost immediately. I answered and let the silence sit there. "Please," he said, his voice small and unraveling. "We're loading the truck right now. We have nowhere to go. Let us set up a payment plan, a few hundred a month. Please don't take the house. It has all our memories in it. Elena needed a family once too," I said, keeping my voice level. "And you let her disappear to protect a story. You chose the house and the story over her. Now you get to live with both of those choices." I hung up before he could answer, opened his contact card, and blocked the number. No reconciliation. No holiday invitations. No second chances. I set the phone down and reached into my jacket pocket, where the 2 crumpled dollar bills from my birthday dinner had been sitting for months. I smoothed them flat on my desk one more time. They were supposed to tell me I was worthless, the final insult from a woman who believed she owned everyone around her. I walked to the shredder in the corner of my office and fed them through. The blades caught the paper, and in less than 2 seconds, the entire symbol of her contempt was reduced to strips of nothing. The ledger was finally balanced. They spent decades putting a price on the people around them, discarding whoever didn't fit the story they wanted to tell. In the end, the exact system they used to control everyone else became the thing that took it all away from them. You don't get to decide what someone else is worth. And money, when it finally comes due, rarely misses an address.